There's a type of person who does their best thinking somewhere no one can reach them, who has never once felt lonely in an empty room, only in the wrong crowd, who tracks their energy the way other people track their time and knows exactly what drains it. The culture has a diagnosis for this. The research says something else entirely. This is their case file. Welcome to the Deviation Archive, where we use psychology to understand the people who deviate from the norm. The popular framing goes like this: people who prefer solitude are avoiding something. They're shy or wounded or quietly depressed. They lack the social confidence to engage, so they've retrofitted their withdrawal into a personality. The preference for aloneness in this reading is compensatory, a story someone tells themselves about a limitation they haven't resolved. This framing has been load-bearing in psychology for decades. It traces back to early clinical models that treated social withdrawal as a reliable indicator of pathology, evidence of avoidant personality structure, attachment disruption, or subclinical depression. The logic was tidy. Humans are social animals. Therefore, the human who consistently moves away from social contact is a human with a problem. What the research never adequately examined was the sample. The people being studied were drawn disproportionately from clinical populations, individuals who had already sought help, who were already in distress. Solitude in that context is not a preference, it's a symptom. The distinction matters enormously, and for decades it was ignored. The assumption baked into the literature was that solitude-seeking and social dysfunction were the same variable wearing different clothes, that if you peeled back the preference, you'd find the wound underneath. What researchers hadn't seriously tested was whether solitude could be something else entirely, not the absence of connection, but a distinct psychological state with its own architecture and its own function. The evidence, when it finally arrived, was not what the field expected. The mechanism is called need for solitude, and it is now studied as a stable psychological trait, distinct from introversion, distinct from shyness, and entirely distinct from loneliness. The key distinction was formalized in research by Avi Asher and colleagues, and later developed extensively by Robert Kaplan, a developmental psychologist at Carleton University who has spent decades disaggregating the different reasons people spend time alone. What Kaplan's work established is that solitude-seeking driven by positive motivation, the active desire for the restorative properties of aloneness, produces measurably different outcomes than solitude-seeking driven by fear or social anxiety. The first is associated with creativity, self-regulation, and well-being. The second is associated with the pathological profile the field had been studying all along. These are not the same behavior. They look identical from the outside. They are neurologically and psychologically distinct. A 2017 study by Tweevy Nguyen, Richard Ryan, and Edward Deci. Ryan and Deci are the architects of self-determination theory at the University of Rochester, found that solitude produces reliable decreases in high arousal affect, agitation, anxiety, the low-grade overstimulation that accumulates across a day of social contact. Crucially, this effect was strongest in people who chose solitude rather than having it imposed on them. The autonomy of the choice was part of the mechanism. Solitude as a chosen state is not merely the absence of stimulation, it is an active regulatory process. There is also accumulating evidence around default mode network activity, the brain's internally directed processing system, most active during reflection, memory consolidation, and imaginative thought. Research out of Harvard and Stanford has found that individuals with stronger default mode network engagement report higher creative output and more robust self-concept clarity. The brain, in other words, does some of its most important work when the social world goes quiet. For some people, that work is not optional maintenance, it is primary functioning. This is what the culture keeps misreading as withdrawal. What does this look like as a person? It looks like someone who is genuinely good at being alone, not merely tolerant of it, but skilled at it. They move through solitary time with intention. They have projects, inner lives, interior landscapes that other people don't fully see because there's rarely an audience present when those things are active. It looks like someone who finds social time genuinely costly, not because they dislike people, but because engagement draws on a resource that solitude replenishes. They show up fully. They leave depleted. The calculus is reliable. and they've learned to manage it, but the management is constant and most. It looks like a person who is frequently misread. Colleagues interpret their self-sufficiency as coldness. Friends interpret their need for recovery time as disinterest. Partners sometimes experience their baseline preference for quiet as a verdict on the relationship. None of these readings are accurate. All of them stick. What the research makes visible is that this person isn't malfunctioning. They are optimizing for a different set of conditions than the ones the social world assumes everyone needs. Now, widen the frame. This isn't a niche profile. Studies suggest that a meaningful proportion of the population shares this trait at clinically significant levels. Yet the psychological literature built to understand them was constructed almost entirely from data on people in crisis. Entire professional structures, open-plan offices, mandatory team building, the cultural suspicion of the person who eats lunch alone, were designed with the assumption that the desire for solitude is a problem to be solved. The implications of getting that wrong are not small. Here is what the research actually found. Solitude, chosen freely and used with intention, is not a deficit state. It is a high-functioning one. The person who requires regular aloneness to think clearly, to regulate emotionally, to maintain a coherent sense of self, that person is not broken. They are accurately calibrated to their own nervous system. The unsettling part is not what this means for them. It's what it means for the environments we've built. We have constructed a world optimized for a particular social profile, one that treats continuous availability as professionalism, communal processing as intelligence, and preference for solitude as something requiring explanation or correction. That architecture doesn't just inconvenience the people who function better alone. It actively misidentifies them. It reads their optimization as dysfunction. The person who leaves the party early isn't failing to connect. They're protecting the conditions under which they function. The person who doesn't miss the social calendar during a long weekend alone isn't depressed. They're replenishing something the social world reliably depletes. The question the research leaves open isn't about the solitude seeker. It's about the diagnostic framework that called them a case in the first place. If the sample was contaminated from the beginning, if the clinical model was built on people in crisis and then applied to people who were simply wired differently, then we haven't been treating a disorder. We've been pathologizing a profile. And the culture that built that framework is still largely in place. Case closed. If you've always done your clearest thinking somewhere no one could find you, the Deviation Archive was made for you. Subscribe and turn on notifications. The next case file is already open.